Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming. I'll be presenting on a study that looks into the overall cost of nutritious diets. This is a pretty extensive list, database of food items that looks into the cost of nutritious diets, where foods are expensive, nutritious diets are expensive. So what's the problem? A very large body of evidence shows that complete nutrition diet may be unaffordable for the poor, especially, and we know that long-run health outcome depends on access to overall diet, not just specific food items. So one must meet all requirements, both macro and micronutrient requirements, to stay healthy. But the poorest of the poor focus mainly in warding off hunger, basically meeting calories. But complete nutrition means meeting lots of dietary requirements. So in this regard, we ask three main questions. First one being, what's the least costly way an individual in a given food environment can achieve complete nutrition? And the other question is, how expensive is the cost of these nutritious diets relative to the cost of just meeting caloric requirements in a survival diet? And lastly, we ask, how does the cost of complete nutrition compare to actual food expenditures? How do we address this problem? So we look into 21 essential nutrient requirements based on the DRI, and we look into a specific group, which is a representative women of reproductive age with median requirements. And we constrain the least cost diet to be within the lower and upper macronutrient distribution range, and it has to also be greater than the estimated average requirement and should be below the upper limits for micronutrients. We basically used World Bank's ICP data, price data, and also food composition, USDA's food composition data, matching each food item in ICP with USDA's food composition data. And we estimate the least cost diet by running linear programming using R, and we find some interesting results. So why does this problem exist? So we see, especially in this graph, we see that the price levels for food and other sectors are quite different. Food is very expensive in low-income countries, and the gap in price levels between food and other sectors is really wide at low-income levels. And as countries become richer, this gap narrows down and sort of converges at the very high income level. And we see here that there are candidate reasons why this may be so. One being high cost of input, low productivity of agricultural products, and also underdeveloped post-harvest value chains in most low-income countries. And as countries get richer, then you see a lot of improvement in that regard, which would show this convergence. So food systems cause systemic variation in prices, and this is a really interesting result that we find, showing differences across different income levels. And we see that dairy, which is a very nutrient-dense but expensive food item, constitutes a very small segment of the least cost diet in low-income countries compared to high-income countries. Whereas, contrarily, you see a very relatively larger segment of the energy coming from fruits, nuts, vegetables, legumes in low-income countries, as opposed to high-income countries. Basically, low-income countries sort of making up this challenge of like meeting nutrients from consuming animal source food such as milk. And one interesting finding that we see here is the cost of diet, the cost of meeting nutrient requirements is really high and accounts for over 50% of a dollar a day poverty line. And it also is more than twice, it's twice as expensive as the least cost diet, which you can see here as the light highlighted line, which is the cost of meeting just caloric needs. So the other thing we look into is the relative cost of meeting nutrition to current spending. And we see very low income, very poor countries are just above or below the current spending on food. And these very low income countries are spending a very large share of their total average, their average spending on meeting their nutrient requirements. But as countries get richer, you see a very consistent decline of this share, and richer countries spend much lower than 50% of their average spending on food. So what's the key message here? We see very interesting results, and the very general finding is that food is really expensive in poor countries. And substitutions to lower cost source of each nutrient helps to reduce the diet cost, especially in low-income settings. But this has very limited scope because very nutrient-rich food items are very expensive in low-income countries. So there is very limited scope for making those substitutions. And even the lowest cost nutritious diet, the cost of meeting calorie needs, is often unaffordable. Vegetable foods enter more often in poor countries, but animal source foods are very costly. And regression results show that diets are cheaper in countries with more electricity and less remoteness. And broader policy implications show that our results provide insights into thinking low-cost diets versus recommended diets and avenues for improving demand-side promotion of programs and policies to improve affordable foods that meet complete diets, and also improving affordability of nutrient-dense foods, especially in low-income settings. Thank you.